once absent stance of Ukraine is now the downtrodden, completely virtuous, completely victimized thing. Russia is the orcs, and everyone associated with Russia is orcish. And it's just the time between an event happening and forming a personal stance about it is zero. Yeah. And I find that really repellent. Yeah. It's a very complex issue. Yeah. And no one's treating it that way.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of those things that's almost the perfect situation for there to be a kind of very black and white narrative about, because we were coming off of, it is kind of weird the Ukraine-Russia thing happened right after, like as soon as the COVID narrative fizzled. We have a new thing to wrap our entire lives around now. And it just kind of arrived at a moment where I think people were really exhausted and don't really want to think about stuff anymore. I mean, I certainly don't. I guess I have a vaguely sort of distant feeling from the whole thing myself. Almost like the images that you see are just kind of like a play-acted tragedy. It doesn't affect my life, other than the fact that gas is going to be really expensive. It doesn't affect my life, and I'm looking at the spectacle unfolding almost as kind of like an invitation to grapple with the question of like, what good does it do to spend my time, joining the social media war against Russia, or focusing all my emotional energy around, because I've been doing that. I've been addicted to scrolling news and just like looking at pictures of terrible things happening to people, and it's been really fucking me up emotionally. And so I'm at a point where I'm just kind of like wondering if the right move is to protect my emotional energy from the collateral damage of all this shit that's happening in the world, because it's not happening here, you know? Like if there was a ship that was going down, I always fall back to like ship metaphors, but if there was a ship going down and there was like a part of the ship that was like really having some serious problems and everyone was drowning, and then there was like a part that people were still doing okay and could still like work and maybe have a chance to like fix the problem, I'd probably want those people who were in a position to like do something to focus on what they were doing and and not feel personally responsible for the fact that other people were suffering. Because, you know, it's really tragic that Ukraine and Russia are fighting each other, and I really don't know, I don't have enough perspective to know. Obviously, like in geopolitical terms, you know, there's the explanation of why they're fighting each other, but in the real, deeper, cultural, karmic terms, why they're fighting each other, I just don't know, because I haven't lived in that part of the world. So, yeah, I think it's one of those things that I'm taking. My practical approach to this is to think about the problem in much more general terms of like, how in the world do we solve the problem of war from a, in a more permanent sense.
Yeah, and we have the same conclusion already about that.
Yeah, we do.
Very anarchist and decentralized, and a Republican would say that America should be focusing on decoupling from China, and either of us would say, and many other people men our age, are saying the same thing, that we need to focus on decoupling the individual from the state.
Yeah, we have to prevent the large, teetering, fragile hierarchies are a liability for the entire human race. Because when the supports get knocked out, they fall over and they like crush people under the rubble as they collapse. And that's what we're seeing in...
Well, they crush... the people who get crushed the most are the people who haven't been undergoing a decoupling process and are still like attached to the 50th story of that collapsing structure.
Yeah, well, you might literally be in an apartment building that is being hit by a ballistic missile. And, if there's any kind of civilization, to have any kind of physical civilization, you have to have some kind of organization. But it's up until this point in history, it's been assumed that any large-scale organization has to be premised on the existence of an elaborate hierarchy, because that's the only kind of technology for consensus that we've managed to engineer so far, because it's very crude and very simple. But there's other types of consensus that are demonstrably more stable and safe than, you know what it is? It's like how automobiles used to have like actual glass, like the same kind of glass that was in your windows for their windshield. And when you hit something, giant shards of glass would come decapitate you, and it was not ideal, right? So they came up with safety glass, and safety glass, is a special kind of glass that when it breaks into little tiny pebbles, and it still sucks, but it's not going to fucking kill you. Safety glass is great. I look at that, I think governments are exactly the same way, that they're like necessary to organize the functioning of things, but when they fail, they don't have a failure mode built into them that is compatible with humans staying alive. And so we have to sort of think about systems, how to engineer systems that fail predictably and fail down to different levels of consensus that don't fail immediately to the violence level of consensus. So there should be like bulkheads, like when a ship has like multiple sections to where like if one part gets flooded, you just seal the doors. You say, okay, that's completely fucked, but at least the rest of the structure is buoyant.
We have a crude version of that happening with this social media fervor and ill-advised economic sanctions. These are things we're doing instead of immediately putting boots on the ground. Although we're doing that too in the form of funneling high-grade weapons to Ukraine for 10 years straight. We're mutually assured destruction is forcing us to try other options.
To have these kind of little proxy conflicts.
I don't know what to say about it, except a huge disgust response, and that's at least half my own karma of me and my relative ability to grasp my own life or not. Like I said this last pod, that a lot of the anger of seeing how idiotic the masses acted around COVID, a lot of that anger was fueled by me wishing I had gotten to a better place of personal power and sovereignty before that happened, and I was angry at myself for not having worked faster and better up to that point. So I'm really disgusted now at the simplistic, unconscious waves of choosing something to freak out about that's like one of the most obscure, like least able to be affected by your Twitter stance, like issues. And meanwhile, like there's other things that China is doing every other day of the week that get no moralistic fervor because our addictions are to China. It's easy and safe to take a stand against Russia in favor of Ukraine. And it's not safe to do that for China taking over Hong Kong, because a lot of the evil in the world is stuff that you are, as an individual, are addicted to. And it's not safe to point point out that it's a bad thing.
Well, I think many people recognize that. Many people know there's kind of a tacit understanding that we're kind of, we've made our deal with the devil, and there's not a lot we can do about China. The Ukraine-Russia thing, it's like this. It's kind of like this. Maybe the reason why it has so much media. Maybe the reason it plays so easily is because it's this kind of contest between good and evil that is mythologically, like you said, kind of, it's the Shire versus the Orcs thing that isn't compromised as much as our economic relationship with China is. And we kind of have this craving for a conflict, because I think there's something about humans that when you feel threatened, you look for a means that you're a path to focus your fighting energy at, and you inevitably caricature the enemy because you have to, because that's the psychological heuristic that we've evolved to not sit around with indecision. You pick something that you think is the devil incarnate and wrap your whole strategy around defeating that thing. For me, that's centralized social media.
Yeah.
So that's I probably go a little too far blaming them for everything wrong with the world, but it's the path to focus my energy. And, you're going to miss a little bit. It's just geopolitically, I wish there was a more, almost like, I'm probably looking at the Cold War era times through rose-colored glasses or whatever, but it definitely seemed like in the Cold War time, maybe things were just at least, they were slow moving enough that you could form some kind of narrative about the Soviet Union. There was like a whole generation that went on this anti-Russia trip, and now it feels like this anti-Russia thing is going to be just one more, like compressed into the span of like 2 months or something.
Yeah, it's
very Terrence McKenna-esque.
It's going to be one more Netflix season of content that everyone binges.
It is.
And then is waiting for the next season of something. And now for something completely different.
Yeah, it's not going to last. It's not going to last 10 years. It'll last, 12 months.
What's disgusting to me about it is people dying in Ukraine could very well last for 10 years.
Yeah, people are still dying in Syria.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I watched Starship Troopers this week. Have you seen this sci-fi film?
Yeah, those bugs.
The bugs.
They're so evil and disgusting. Burn them all.
I've been on a Robert Heinlein journey, and so I was ready to read Starship Troopers next, but I could tell by the reviews that the audiobook wasn't up to par, so I watched the movie that night instead. And the book itself is an intellectual philosophical exercise of contemplating a futuristic world federation that's gone completely fascist, and this is the solution they've created for all this future complexity.
Yeah.
And so a fascist military rule has certain requirements to sustain itself. And so the bugs are the perfect target to aim and unite the populace.
Yeah.
And the complaints about the movie are that it's this terrible, action, mindless, it doesn't touch on the nuances and satire of the book at all. But I think it totally does. It's just the film never shows its hand and winks at you. It's just a complete fascist propaganda film from the front to the back. And every chance to empathize with the bugs is a dramatic scene of doubling down on hatred for the bugs and everyone cheering.
Yeah.
And triumphal, brass instruments of army music plays. And it's like it creates its own satirical comment on fascist propaganda by being a piece of fascist propaganda that is also a really well-made sci-fi action movie, which is its own comment on the human psyche.
When was that made?
I was like 9 or 10 when I saw it in theaters.
Was it post 9/11?
No.
No. Okay.
No, it would have held the awareness of that its vibe in some noticeable way, as everything did after that point, and it definitely used 90s naivete to the fullest to make like the least politically correct thing ever, and to like, you know, make a comment about the military-industrial complex. But it's also just a really funny, amazing action film that's like really well made, and the bugs look fucking crazy, and practical effects were still had a budget back then, so army people getting torn apart by these pincer bugs is like these physical mannequins, and it all looks very good.
When you say had a budget, you mean the amount of money that they had to work with was less than they do now?
No, I mean there was a budget to do things for real.
Oh, for real, yeah,
and there isn't a budget to do anything but CG now.
Right.
There's barely a budget to make movies anymore now.
Really?
COVID is this huge sea change that compounded with the Netflix attitude of quantity over quality.
Throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks?
At the lowest cost possible.
Yeah.
And movies aren't making money anymore, and we'll see if that changes over the next few years. We'll see if theaters exist again, and we'll see if theater going exists anymore. But and there's no money at the ticket sales anymore. There's no money at DVD sales anymore, which would like double your box office sales. So there's no speculation money available. Every movie any studio makes is this huge gamble of millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so that just can't really work as an economic model anymore. But no one's really figured out how to do it any differently. So the amount a studio is willing to gamble on a movie is like way lower. And so practical effects, like spending any amount of time on actually developing the story before you just cut it together and just throw whatever slop you have out to the audience.
Star Wars.
Like like something that happens in the big budget Marvel movies, everything's compartmentalized, and they'll literally film the action scenes and be developing the CG of a full action scene before they have a script.
Really?
Before they have a story.
And so they just like
just because there's time for the CG studio to just start.
Right.
And the script writer is like, well, writing scripts is really hard, and I'm doing it by committee besides. So it's going to take some time. But CG is like, that's much more of like a factory thing.
Oh, fascinating. It's like almost like sounds like it's some kind of like a software development process or something. That's crazy. Where you have like product managers that are like for each little section of the thing. Oh wow, that's no wonder you get something very predictable.
It has to be very predictable so that these different compartments that don't communicate with each other can know that it'll have a semblance of uniting narrative in the end product if it's the most generic plot possible. And then, so like in this context today was what I watched Starship Troopers this week with, and it's the director Verhoeven, who also made Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mm-hmm. He just has this tongue-in-cheek irony of like, you can tell he's having an amazing time while making fun of the appetite for violence, but he loves the violence and the war porn too. And he makes it as gory as possible,
right.
But he doesn't have any illusions about it being a good thing. Like, he includes the fact that it's bubblegum entertainment.
So is there any little clue at all in the movie? Is there any little, like, wink at the audience?
It starts with a propaganda infomercial.
Okay.
And they cut the different chapters apart by putting in a new propaganda infomercial.
Gotcha.
And then they end it with a propaganda infomercial, so then you can like make the associational leap that this whole thing is just a propaganda film for this war machine that depends on the bugs being an enemy.
Right. I think I saw that movie when I was a kid, and it really scared me a lot. I was so scared of the bug that has the little thingy that goes in your brain.
The brain sucker.
Dude, that scared me so much when I was a kid.
And that's another amazing thing about this movie is you saw all of it. You saw his brains getting sucked out of his fucking head, and it was not CG. It was all physical, and that's just like, that's so fucking brutal. And what passes for brutality these days is just very, there's a very casual attitude to violence in R-rated movies these days that's somehow worse than the casual attitude of a Verhoeven film. Like, partly because it's CG, they have no physical responsibility. Like, they don't have to feel the actual fictional event they're creating at all. They're just way more detached from it. Things are grosser these days. In a movie like John Wick, where you see Keanu Reeves murder probably 200 people from the front to the end of the film, and it's that like fascist army killing the bugs and feeling no remorse, but without the self-awareness of it being a satire.
Well, I think I actually watched John Wick recently. For the first time. Okay. And a friend of mine wanted to watch it, and so yeah, it was an invitation to the whole draw of the movie is the invitation to take the side of a remorseless killer. The whole point is just like, this guy, look what happened to him. They killed his fucking dog. Okay. Right. He really deserved. These fuckers have it coming. Yeah. Okay, so now you can.
And they're all Russian, by the way.
They are, aren't they?
So
shit, they are.
It's added bonus for painting them as orcs.
That's crazy. I didn't even think I already picked up on that. That's true. Yeah, they. Yeah, so you step into the mind of this person who is totally. It's like you don't. It almost feels like it's a really easy movie to watch, because you don't ever, like, the whole point of the movie is you don't feel bad about any of the bad guys. Yeah. Yeah. I guess that's the whole point of that movie. Is it's like a revenge movie. You know, it's like the same kind of thing of like the this asshole, this guy who, you know, maybe does something really terrible to a woman, and then she goes on this huge revenge fantasy trip. Yeah. And then the people who watch that are invited to identify with that character and then imagine themselves taking revenge on, you know, the men who've hurt them or. Yeah. So I don't know what John Wick is. Maybe it's like, I think there's this part of this. There's a kind of it's like what a person who's never really done violence, never really been exposed to violence, what they imagine. It's like kind of like a naive person's imagination of a violent society of people who
Yeah.
are like fun, sexy, and stone cold killers. And
Well, at its best, John Wick is the art of action choreography and the art of gunplay. People like John Wick because the guns are accurate and behave accurately. And so, like, everyone who likes guns, the filmmakers included, need to create fictional contexts for the guns to actually be used and enjoyed.
right.
So guns have advanced so far in this point in history, but spiritually, because of mutually assured destruction, there's no avenue to express these new innovations. And so that's where a movie like John Wick has to be made. Like, the only enjoyable moment I had watching a moment in a John Wick film was watching him quad load a shotgun, and that's like a physical thing that requires a lot of training to have a clip of 2 or 4 shotgun shells clipped together and load them into the shotgun in one swipe. And so you just get to see Keanu Reeves show off his skills at doing that really well.
Yeah. I think, his role in The Matrix probably had something to do with the sort of classic action movie approach. That probably is the best thing you can say about it, is that it's a celebration of what an action movie looks like, where there's just cars flipping over, and I don't know. I guess I'm not that interested in that whole thing. I don't know much about movies. I don't really look at them that way. It's it does feel like there's less and less movies that really are worth discussing.
Yeah.
We're definitely reaching back and trying to sort of reconstruct where we are based on the movies of the past, and trying to figure out what trajectory that indicates that we were on, where we are now.
Jade and I's latest piece, though, is on a movie we liked a lot.
Oh, yeah?
So you should check that out.
What's it called?
The Vast of Night.
Is that a modern movie? Mm-hmm. Vast of Night.
It's brand new, and the director funded the entire thing himself. $700,000 to make this film.
Wow.
Out of his own pocket.
Wow.
And he did a fucking amazing job.
Wow.
And $700,000 for a movie is like the shoestringiest of shoestring budgets. So it's this amazing piece of what you can do with very little.
That's amazing.
No gambling necessary on part of a movie studio, who then has to like weigh in on every decision because it's their money. It's just pure art.
So you know what this means? I can see what's going to happen now. Movies are going to become independent productions again. It has to.
Yeah.
There's going to be, it's just, basically it's the process of, it's the disintermediation thing. It's studios being outmoded as the production, the places where culture is produced. You're gonna have more funding avenues opened up. I think funding is going to be,
and you're going to have a lot of physical resources of studios that go under, get loosed into the populace of the entrepreneurs at really low prices, and the skills tradesmen looking for jobs will be forced to take much cheaper jobs. And so the price of making an independent film will go down as well.
Well, that kind of process is what is, that similar kind of process contributed to Silicon Valley's formation in the Bay Area, is after there was a huge amount of expertise of like semiconductors and engineers who were working for the military-industrial complex, basically, who kind of got, after the Cold War ended, they sort of they worked at startups. And yes, that's just the natural cycle of things, is you centralized things die and then they fertilize the soil.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a couple prompts of yours from last night.
Yeah, maybe because I've been, like I said, I've been addicted to this Ukraine-Russia situation. I've been on just like an emotional roller coaster of seeing people who look like Finnish people and me, and they're living in a place that is pretty close to where I used to live, and they're living in block houses that look identical to the one I used to live in. And it's weird that to see bombs raining down on like a place that could be a photograph from my own personal memory. Is weird, and I don't know. Maybe it's just, that amount of like empathy for people getting bombed to hell is a new thing for me. And I wish it wasn't the case, but it is the truth that people getting bombed in Somalia somehow was easier to ignore because I just don't have as much personal experience with that milieu. Obviously, I know those people have just as much pain as people everywhere, but just having to see that happen and think about what is my responsibility in all of this has kind of given me this just this basic. I was telling Alicia about this last night. I have this really strong desire to just live in the real world, and not be like not let myself get pushed into a fantasy world, not let myself be pushed into a kind of sandbox reality where I circumscribe the set of problems I think are important, but rather just try to get outside of every sandbox I'm in and try to escalate my, in terms of software, like privilege escalation, where I'm basically just trying to get more and more context on everything to where I can see the most objective, common, grounded, like I'm in the real game, not the sub game inside the game, but just try to get out into, because that's the game in which Ukraine and Russia are playing out. That's the base level game. And I want to be someone who lives in that game so that I'm not surprised about what's happening, because I think everything makes sense if you have the right model. And when you see these kind of things happening that are just like, I don't understand, it's like, you're right, you don't understand, because it's not that it doesn't make sense, you just don't understand it. And Russia, Ukraine, it makes perfect sense. And I'm trying to trying to face the situation and develop my perspective in such a way that I don't shrink away from it, and I'm not made hysterical by it, I'm not pushed around by it. I understand it and I recognize it in the same way that I understand things in the environment are good for you, things are bad for you, your day-to-day reality. I want to be in this, the things that are real, like other people, money, skills, what do you, beliefs, like what do you think about good and evil? What are you going to do with your life? Time, your health, like these are the things that are elements of this game that are the most important things. And so that's all the context in which you asked me if what are different, I'm reading implications into the prompt here. What are the different results of thinking that the world is basically good? Yes.
Versus what happens if you think the world is basically evil? So this is good in the Genesis 1 sense of the word. In the beginning was God created the heavens and the earth, and he saw that it was good.
like very, I
So
guess.
existentially, base level, it's better that all that is exists
rather than not.
rather than not.
Yeah, and the way it relates to this game thing I'm talking about is any kind of, like, there's a way, like, we want to feel that what is good. We have to feel that, otherwise you become depressed and suicidal. And so one way of making your reality good is to limit your reality and just go, Russia, Ukraine, life, whatever. You know what? I'm gonna double down on the things I just have around me, and I'm not gonna really bother to try to understand other things. That's one way of doing it. But I guess I'm not satisfied with that. That whole idea of thinking of the world itself as good is like saying, it's kind of like the statement that the game itself, the big game, is worth the candle, so to speak. That the game that we're playing, that we don't have any control over defining what the rules are, but rather we're trying to discover what the rules are, just a conviction that that game is worth it. Because that's the game that got us here. The fantasies we have about how the world works is not the reason why we're here. We're a product of this more of the highest level of reality.
Well, JP's, Jordan Peterson's conviction, which is a different version of my own, is that those miniature fantasies that we have personally are the biological function of perceiving any amount of that real game. The way we perceive those things is by telling personal, super characterized stories about it. You do have a rational mind responsibility to check the results of your created narrative at regular intervals and keep adjusting it and keep expanding it in response to the things the universe throws back at you. But one of his points is that we don't perceive the real world at all except by telling ourselves stories about it.
Right, but we're drawing on a certain reservoir of content to populate our stories that we construct in this world. Like, I think you can suffer from having a limited number of pieces to work with. You're going to build a kind of silly, ineffectual, caricatured narrative of your life if you're only drawing from a limited pool of, which, I guess it's like you want to go out and strike down and find the deepest substance you can, which is something like life and death and war and peace and freedom, slavery.
And free will.
Hate and love, men and women, countries, kings, gods, demons, like those kind of things is the things that, like, universal things that are just as real now as they've been ever. But we just have, like, computers and guns and jets and stuff now. But we're not really... I guess the thing that is somewhat appealing about this big game is that it's the oldest game, in some sense. It's the basic game that hasn't changed, and the basic problem of the game of how to live in peace and how to be happy and how to, like, that's why world peace, when people go, what do you want? World peace? What they're pointing at is that the world peace is the biggest unsolved problem of humanity.
It's making me think, and I think I've brought up this Hermann Hesse book before. I don't even remember the name of it. Damon or Damien, one of those two, probably. There's whatever the word title of the book is, it's supposed to make you think of a daemon while spelling it differently to potentially be someone's name.
Gotcha.
But this fictional story of Hesse's takes place right before World War I, and it's a like most of his books, it's the story of individuation and a man trying to find himself in his time as opposed to being a group self. And he, as most Hesse books go, he gravitates towards spiritual teachers around him that are maybe his age, that are maybe older than him, adults that are maybe like about to fucking die. It's a story of meeting his soul family and learning something universal about the world that can help him grapple with the time that he's in. And the time is right before World War I in Europe. And it was notable to me, this story, because the way his enlightened soul family that was like teaching him about the world, their attitude towards World War I was of this basically neutral human wave of innovation and discovery and novelty. And they didn't know what it was going to look like. They were taking it for granted that a lot of people living a life of conflict were going to translate that wave of novelty as a war and go take part in that. But it was a notable story for like the excitement amongst people talking about this like event they could feel brewing in the world and inside themselves, and they were going to go to war, and it was going to be like the most exciting thing that had happened yet.
Wait, so
in their lives.
was this book written before World War I, or was it written after, about the time before World War I?
It must have been written after.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't know at the top of my head, but I'm sure Hesse like lived before and during and after World War I, so it was writing from that perspective.
Yeah, those. My understanding of World War I is that a lot of people had really never seen like a mechanized war before. And
Well,
so,
it was the first one.
right. And
no
so,
one, even the like
Right.
insidious state cabinets had never seen it before.
didn't understand what it meant. Yeah, and it was almost looked at it was kind of like this refreshing political shakeup that would somehow. Yeah, those were pretty heady times at the beginning of the 20th century.
Like I remember listening to Dan Carlin's podcast on it, and he was describing the huge boundary break of culture and narrative from before World War I to after, where armies were showing up to the battlefield still wearing the like super colorful like bullseye on their uniform things, and still like riding cavalry to the front lines, just things that are completely irrelevant when machine guns are involved. And they just had to find out by thousands of people dying that this is a new way to fight now.
Yeah, war is just kind of anonymous, ugly, and industrialized.
Which I think is a necessary revelation of its true character.
Yeah.
And in that sense, World War I was a saving grace of like, we got to make it harder and harder and harder to romanticize this basically ugly and grotesque thing.
Well, the archetype of the warrior is never going to leave humanity, and I don't believe it should. I think the archetype of the warrior is important, but we have to find a way to channel it in ways that don't create suffering.
Well, that's the problem of the male condition.
Kind of, yeah.
Is
It's one of the aspects of it.
we have to figure out how to be male more aggressively than ever if we're going to address anything in the real game. But we can no longer do it in a zero-sum, violent way. And that's the only way that's been modeled for the warrior archetype, is you illustrate your warriorness by taking something from someone weaker than you. Or, you know, destruction necessary to establishing masculinity.
Yeah, like in the most, like the Spartan who has to go kill a helot slave to complete the passage into adulthood or something like
Yes,
that.
and
Something
that's just not.
grotesque like that.
It's just
Yeah.
can't be the way men earn their stripes today. And so what you have in the interim is a bunch of emasculated femboys. But on the other side of things, we will hopefully have a new statement of what it means to be masculine. That is, able to be a healthy part of the forest.
I think that the emasculated femboy thing is the reason that is, like, you and I as men see that with contrast, to the contrast of things, but I think that it's men and women, all people who are subject to this sort of diminishing tendency toward your basic nature, whether your basic nature is masculine or your basic nature is feminine, or both somehow. I think that there's a tendency to try to caricature whatever your basic nature is, and maybe it's just less obvious the way that it affects women, or maybe it's less obvious to me because I'm not a woman and I don't know, but I think that there's a kind of basic blockage of the sexual energies that is kind of blocking the progress of culture in some sense. Mm-hmm. That, and I wish I knew more about that, to be honest.
And conflict and war, as I've said many times on the show, conflict and war has been an established method of unleashing the sexual energies. And so part of the reason for
everyone's just killing and burning and raping and,
And part of the reason for that blockage that you just mentioned is we've got to figure out a new way to do things interpersonally and internationally.
Yeah, it's like we need a challenge. We need things that are exciting and that you feel like you can throw your entire fury at, that no one can stop you and is not subject to revocation by some paternal figure. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's like a child that's trying to break away from their parents. I remember being a teenager and having this feeling of like, wait, so I'm an independent will, and like what I decide to do has bearing on reality and not just what I can convince other people to let me do. Mm-hmm. That's the fundamental break between being a preteen and like an adolescent, is when you start looking at your own will as something you can use, and something that is like not just something you have to apologize for. It's something that is what you have. And I feel maybe we're kind of like that as a whole culture, is that we still are sort of feel like we need to set up these paternalistic institutions to keep the guardrails on who we're allowed to be and what we're allowed to do and what's allowed to happen. And anything that gets too crazy is kind of just like hammered back towards the mean, unless it's war, of course, which is is a super bipartisan project typically.
So the other part of your prompt was about an attitude of the meaning of things and challenging your own presupposition that the meaning of life is simply that you give it whatever meaning that you want, and then enjoy the results.
Yeah.
And then that's becoming too lazy of a explanation.
Yeah,
for the big capital M meaning.
Yeah, I guess I find myself kind of getting tired of the wishy-washy existentialist, she's like, what's the meaning of life? You ask your authority figure or something, you say, well, it's whatever you want it to be. Just the world, nothing means anything, and you can just decide to be an actor, and then that's the meaning in the world for you. Okay, that's great, but I think that I'm not saying that is wrong. I'm saying it's incomplete, maybe. That's the feeling I've been having, is that I suspect that there's just more, like I'm beginning to suspect that there actually is a lot more meaning that is objective in the world, that is not the product of your own perspective. And I guess another way of saying that is it's almost kind of like getting into some kind of occult territory, where there's this idea of the occult, where there is some kind of narrative that is embedded in the very nature of the world, in the very fabric of societies, and there's kind of thing that is not just, and I'm just interested in taking a look at trying to shift my perspective as an experiment and think, okay, if I were living my life with the supposition that there really were these forces at play that were making things happen that weren't just the sum total of everyone contributing what they had. To me, it seems more interesting.
I think, I think it is true that what's the meaning? Well, it's whatever meaning you give it. I think that is true. I also think it's true that there's meta meanings, really, really big narrative meanings of the music of the spheres.
Yeah.
And I think those are discoverable. I think they're objective and discoverable.
Yeah.
But I think they're created. I think some higher stack layer of activity at some point saw a blank slate and had to put something there. And we can discover those things, and you discover the greater meaning by finding the relative resonance between your personal little narratives and how well they resonate with the exterior world. And that's like the way we discover those bigger and bigger and bigger meanings.
This is like the personal narrative that is how you see the larger narratives.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get a bigger picture of objectivity, you have to start throwing out bigger and wilder hypotheses.
Oh, interesting.
And in terms of like the world, is it basically good? Is it basically bad? You're going to get the results of thinking that way. Whichever way you get, you're going to have that reinforced for you.
You're going to find resonance with that, yeah.
But there's more free radical money and more people active in the greater universe of all that is in the subscription group of people who think existence is basically good.
Yeah.
You're going to get an more exciting set of message boards on that website. And the kinds of objective things you're going to discover along that line of reasoning are going to be, there's no glass ceiling. If things are basically good and action is basically good, then it continues. And whatever spark of agency happened 1 billion years ago, on that presupposition that things are good, as long as that assumption continues that things are good, there's no glass ceiling of stopping making things gooder and gooder and better and better and better. And so truly monolithic things are available to be discovered for the people who are willing to believe that there's something meaningful to discover.
Yeah, I think I do not even believe necessarily that there is these things in the world. It's more of an experience. Like I feel it. I feel that there is. And I feel a lot of times that there's this, I feel like resonance with greater meaning that I wish I was able to respond to more. And I feel like I frequently just am getting hit by resonance with, like I'm tripping over these invitations to resonate more with things that I don't know how to describe. And it's, like just like the Russia and the Ukraine situation, it's so mythic, and it's so, there's so much suffering, and it's such a human thing that's happening. Is it just brings up lots of little paths to connect your personal narrative to the overall narrative. And I feel like I just have too small of a language to deal with that currently, and I'm trying to just pay more respect to the idea that it's there to be connected to, and just try to quiet my own try to quiet my own assessments of things for a second, so I can get more information to have an articulation that can draw in more things that are hidden, more things that are buried a little deeper in my own personal psyche.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a really good. The music of the spheres thing is something that the idea that there's like a higher intelligence that is put something there. From our perspective, we have to treat that like the game that we're in. It's just the landscape to us. It's what we're dealing with. And very Terence McKenna-esque idea that there's a scale invariance where everything tends to recapitulate itself.
I think there's an argument of logic for there being bigger actors that are basically benevolent. The argument being that everything would self-destruct itself. So there must be positive actors on very high levels of the stacks, constantly sending new updates into things.
If the world wasn't basically good, it would have all gone to hell already.
It would just snuff out.
Yeah, this wouldn't be happening. I know it's a very like argument, very anthropic principle kind of thing. Or to put it in very reductive mathematical terms. You could be someone who fixates on the idea of infinity, or you can fixate on zero. And even though zero and infinity might look like they're equivalent opposites, they're not. They have a fundamentally different character, because you can point to zero, and zero is always zero. Infinity is more of an idea. You can't point to infinity. Infinity doesn't. There's no such thing as infinity. There's infinities. Because any number can be infinity.
And infinity can only really be perceived by looking at its fruits.
Yeah.
You can't look at the thing itself.
No, infinity is basically a way of saying, well, there just isn't a biggest number. There's no endpoint. Mm-hmm. This is a concept that represents the idea that we can't form a concept about where this ends. And maybe whatever your personal metaphysics is, if you think that zero is the ground of reality, or that infinity is the ground of reality, this is kind of like where the world, our culture is just getting into this kind of high stakes nihilism, or it wants to polarize people to be either delusional optimists or hopeless nihilists. That seems to be the two platters that are offered to new people who are coming into the world now and growing up. Is it's like, are you gonna seize the world and become a famous YouTuber, or are you gonna just vape in your basement for the next 40 years and play just jerk off to anime? Because those are your two options. Which one is it going to be? Which one? There isn't a credible case that people are making that well, maybe you should go to college and 30 years from now, and we're gonna the world's gonna be over, nothing matters anymore, or we're gonna be living in space, and isn't that crazy? The dollar totally not gonna exist, better invest in Bitcoin, or China's gonna own the world, or we're all probably gonna be dead from the Zeta variant of COVID, or the next engineered bioweapon. We're almost living. It's a fantastical, silly, ridiculous. What's the word I'm looking for? Eschatology that we're painting as totally what's going to happen. The truth is probably not. any of that. It's probably going to be decades that come after this. There's going to be the 20s, there's going to be the 30s, going to be 40s, and those are going to look like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and there's going to be great things, and there's going to be a lot of bullshit, and there's going to be people that are still alive at the end of that who also don't understand what just happened. And I can't, I guess I just want to just wait it out a little bit and try to keep my hand on whatever I can control.
Well, I'm certainly just waiting it out in terms of a Russo-Ukrainian conflict. I'm not going to say anything about the basic stance or the basic goodness or the basic necessary response of any of those things. I'm just going to...
You're not going to participate in a war? How dare you, Alex? People are dying.
Yeah.
They need your tweets. If you don't take a stand on social media, it's personally your fault.
I'm just going to sit back and watch this happen because COVID just happened.
Yeah.
And before that, Trump just happened. I'm still collecting data.
Yeah, you and me both, man. I'm sort of done letting my life be wound around somebody else's axle. I just don't care anymore.
Okay. What is a thought?
What's a thought?
That's the bonus round.
That hoe over there?
No.
Oh, you mean thought.
What's a thought, Stuart?
An object designed to influence our... thought is an object designed by evolution, designed by evolution, that kind of escaped the sandbox that evolution made.
Does it require language to still be a thought?
Depends how you define language.
There is some sort of line in the sand that we draw with language that before that it's a feeling and an impression and an action or a force or an instinct, but at some point after that line it's an articulated version of that same thing.
Okay, so I'm going to say yes.
It requires language.
Yes, it is language. Language is composed wholly of thought.
But thought doesn't need language because you can think in any kind of language, which tells me that it's independent of language.
Well, I think a thought is...
Because you can think in Chinese, and you can think in English.
Right, but a thought is a thought is composed of language, some kind of language. Language is made of thoughts. I think it's the same thing. I think a thought is language.
What I'm saying at this exact moment is that language is the clothing of the thought.
Language is the clothing of the thought.
There's a basic nuclei to it, though. That isn't a kind of language we know about.
Right. Because, I can imagine, I could have a thought that's like there's these trees that are in front of us. If I asked you to think about those trees falling down, can't you kind of see it happening? Mm-hmm. I can see it happening. I can see that tree falling down. I can hear the sound of it crashing on the thing. I can imagine it. I can witness that event in my mind, even though it didn't actually happen. I think I wouldn't call that a thought.
You wouldn't call that visualization a thought?
No.
It's just a visualization?
Yeah.
But no, because if you are a higher actor simulation moderator, a super being thing, a given thought of yours would be this multi-dimensional art object of co-acting visualizations.
Yeah.
And each visualization maybe would be hyperdense with sentences within the tree.
Yeah, it's kind of like, do you...
Like, that's an idea that whatever fucking Elon Musk chips in your heads, what's it called?
Neuralink?
Yeah, Neuralink presupposes that a thought can be a visualization, so that one of your thoughts can use the cyborgness to use
Sure.
the higher bandwidth to put more across in any given thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about right now is just we're trying to decide how should we define the word thought. That's the only question we're talking about. We know what a visualization is. We know what language is. We know we live and breathe language and visualizations. It's a question of what's the most useful way, where's the most sensible, non-arbitrary place to draw the line between a thought and other kinds of experience, if there is any line at all.
There's also an anecdote of knowing a teacher of ASL, and the way she describes teaching kids sign language who have grown up deaf. And the experience she was describing was that these kids, if they're raised and are deaf and not taught sign language, they literally do not develop. They're like still infants in big bodies.
Yeah.
Because they can't fucking think.
Wow.
And until someone gives them ASL, they've never thought before. And so they're still fucking like infants perceptually.
So they need to have their hands be able to do something for their brain to be able to do something.
They need words.
Yeah.
Specifically words. They need language to develop.
Yeah. There's so my understanding of recent human evolution connects to this idea that Terence McKenna has talked about, and no, I'm not talking about the stone date theory, I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the adaptive pressures that have influenced the size of the human brain and the development of the human brain since the development of language. And that, from one perspective, the evolution of language and the evolution of the human brain are both aspects of, they kind of co-evolved as part of the same system. Because...
Yeah, and you have some message is the medium, or the medium is the message kind of vibe in there.
Well,
shape of language is partially a result and communicative of the function of a human brain.
Yeah, specifically in the recent human evolution. So Terence McKenna has this idea that part of his thing is that the world is made of language, and that the story of human civilization is the story of language. The story of symbolic representations building on each other. And to me that's very clear. I agree with him about that, and I sort of connect it to the idea of human evolution. I start thinking about, so say you have some primates. This isn't dispensing with mushrooms, okay? We're not even talking about stoned ape. We're not talking about psilocybin. We're just talking about just primates living in an ordinary environment. Your body has, there's certain mutations that can happen that might benefit you. You might be a really big, strong, robust monkey, and then that's good, so those genes get favored, whatever, okay. So your environmental conditions, though, are somewhat, they're like the driving variable. They're the thing that your biology is responding to, and you're staying in equilibrium with the environment as it changes. However, now imagine that language comes onto the scene in some way, that there's some strain of monkeys, there's some monkey that has this unreasonably large sized brain that has all this some spare processing capability that can make models of the future now and can sort of see into the future a bit more than the other animals. The other animals can see maybe 10 seconds ahead. This monkey can see a few hours ahead. So that right there immediately becomes more powerful. That becomes the most, like, that latent ability to see the future is now the most salient aspect of your environment. So your body is now part of the context in which your genes are selecting for. So without language, without a sophisticated verbal culture, there's a marginal effectiveness of being able to visualize things happening. But then as soon as you have words that are basically kind of like the software that runs on that hardware, you get this feedback loop where you have monkeys that are smart enough to use basic words, and then those basic words then create, they become embedded in the culture of this group, and then that creates a further adaptive incentive for bigger brains to speak more words, which then creates more words, and you have this kind of positive feedback coupling between the hardware of the monkey mind and the culture that can take advantage of that hardware. And that verbal culture and the monkey mind, I mean, to me, that's probably why the human cranium in the last 50,000 years, according to fossils, has exploded in size. I don't know how else you'd explain that.
Because you get so much benefit evolutionarily by being a little smarter than the people around you.
And specifically, you get more benefit for being smart when language is already a thing than you do if language wasn't a thing. Because imagine we took, there was something where the Men in Black little flashing, forgetting thing, the aliens came up and, the 2001 Space Odyssey Star Child status just, the whole world forgot everything. No more language, no more, all our books were erased, everything, we're just sitting around. Well, you know what? Einstein is probably not that much better off than your average person now, because what does he have to work with? Nothing. No one can even talk. So great, he can probably there's no way he can invent the theory of relativity because he doesn't even know how to read. So humans' cognitive capacity, I think, is adapted to a world in which language is a huge part of, like our brains are evolved to live in a civilization, and civilization is the product of our brains.
Yeah.
And there's this physical manifestation. So a thought, from this perspective, a thought is everywhere at the same time. Even physical objects are thoughts. It's completely arbitrary, I think, where we draw the line and where we say the line between what is a symbol and what is not a symbol is a function of the person who's using the thing as a symbol or not. Like, from the perspective of a person who can read, letters are symbols. From a from a perspective of someone who doesn't know what that is, they're not. It's not a symbol.
Yeah.
A symbol is an aspect of the environment that is running the code. Yeah.
Yeah, and a moment from James Cameron's Avatar comes to mind, where the Pocahontas character is teaching the John Smith character how to read the language of the jungle.
Oh, yeah.
How to listen to the plants.
Right.
How to listen to the wind going through the leaves. And that's how you, read this web page. And then you can respond accurately and know where the food is, or know where safety is. If you have the right, if you have the language to understand the abstractions that are being presented to you in physical forms.
Well, even being a member of a culture involves reading situations and reading a tremendous amount of symbolic information about what you're allowed to do and what can happen. Like, you walk up on a group of people, you immediately just downloaded a whole book of information from that scene. What they're wearing, what they look like, how old they are, what they're saying, the way their eyes dart at you, you know what you're allowed to do. And it's like, so that's the book, and you can tell that obviously there's people, our culture is not the only language, and you can tell that there's people who have vastly different abilities to read the world. and read other people. And there's people who don't understand that the people they interact with are symbols themselves of a larger pattern that's happening. And you don't have to, but maybe this connects to that idea of the occult, larger reality, the larger narrative that's embedded in things. Like, I want to know, what are the ancient hieroglyphs that are written on the world that I don't know how to read and nobody knows how to read, but are there?
Some Voynich manuscript, keys.
Maybe.
Keys to unlock.
But it would not in a book.
Code.
Not like in a book, not like a manuscript, but I just mean like just maybe in the way that like something like the way that humans happen to be scattered across the world, or the way etymology has a lot, like the reason why we have words for certain things and not others. What does that say about what happened to us and who we are and what we want? That kind of thing. Like, what are the hieroglyphs that are like inscribed on the deepest layers of our own psyche that, what kind of cataclysms happened to us as cavemen that we're still affected by? Like, how deep does this go?
Yeah. Yeah, all I've been responding with in my adult life is to create new symbols myself.
Right.
And then I'm forced to a confrontation of all the layers of reality that I need to draw on to make a new symbol. It's a very concrete confrontation with reality, with a lot of different realities, inner and outer. If you're making a new symbol, then it's what am I saying? What do I want to say? Who am I? What has been my experience? What should my experience be instead of what's here? And also, what can I use in terms of other things people have made? I depend on other people having the same shrugging decision of like, I guess I'll like push the boulder of human civilization up the mountain a little bit. Like, my decision to do that has been like, I completely depend on every other person who's made that positive decision. And then I take it for granted, with the example of albums of music, I take it for granted that, it took me 4 years to make one. It's taken me another 4 years to make another. But each one, in a meta sense, is only going to be one letter. And then I'm going to discern a bigger, more objective, higher being meaning by seeing the way those letters self-assemble into a meta word that I wasn't conscious of making. But something was conscious of making it because they self-assemble into some radical meta order, when I'm 100 years old or something.
Yeah. I mean, you, as am I suppose, are on the path of the symbol smith, and we are devoting a tremendous amount of energy to making symbols. And there must be a reason we're doing that. I never really have examined why. Maybe what it is it's like a will to power or a will to survive. It's maybe because I implicitly understand that symbols have power, and I'm trying to do the thing that is with the current of the world as I perceive it.
Yeah, symbols have power, and fresher symbols, say one that you make, has a higher adaptability to the current world. And so you get all the benefits of having your name on it if it becomes a necessary ingredient in the world's sense-making. But then you get the many orders of magnitude more powerful power of being a symbol smith. That's a much deeper level of adaptability to the world, is if you can see what's happening. Oh, it's unprecedented. What do we do? I guess I'll make a new thing that hasn't ever been made before to respond to this thing, because I know how to do that. Something I thought when you asked, like, well, you'd like it all to like have a reason for things. I think, like, in the way of maybe the albums and the bigger pieces of art that I make and that I help make can self-assemble into like a reason that it was all happening way on down the line. I think, like, is it all happening for a reason, or does there come a crux point, a point of cusp, to use Robert Heinlein's language, where you suddenly find yourself in the pilot's chair, and you have all that is spread out in front of you with the kill switch in front of you, and suddenly it's you all along that was going to decide it is good or not. And what's going to give you the strength to make the correct decision at the point of cusp when you find yourself in God's chair? It's all the iterations of making symbols according to your highest ideals at every given point. That's a training education to make sure that you make a responsible decision when you have all your life's work in front of you, and if you find madness at that point, you might at that point in your education have the power to reassemble the madness into reason and go, is it all happening for a reason? Well, now it is.
So maybe that's what being born is just finding yourself in the driver's seat again, based on what you achieved in life. Maybe you were like, because that to me, what you're just like, having the kill switch in front of you is the thing that most characterizes what life is. It's a continuous choice to exist.
Yeah.
And you have all this power, and you find your awareness seated at this location of central influence, and you have a kill switch. And you have, no one's telling you what to do, and that's the whole point. It's a test to decide if you will care or not. And so maybe I don't really know exactly what I mean by this, but maybe creating that higher level symbol is maybe that's the path to being born again in some way. I mean, maybe you can see this in people's lives, not my life, maybe in my life in some microcosmic ways, and other things that have happened to me. I felt like I was reborn into a new seat of a new place of power, based on having done something, and the other things I used to care about dropped away, and a new set of imperatives presented themselves to me. And it's this kind of, even growing up within the span of a single human ego, you can see this happening. But I don't think we would be here having this conversation if we hadn't done a whole lot of groundwork in somewhere, somehow, sometime to get here to talk about this. There's a lot between us and the diffuse cloud of hydrogen gas 20 billion years ago. A lot's happened in between then and now. And I'm going to say that you and I probably played a role in it in some way that we can't remember.
There as dreamers. Yeah. There as bodiless dreamers.
Yeah, we were waiting for our time. Just waiting. Lurking.
Okay. I remember coming out here to look for owl pellets
Owl pellets?
with a girlfriend.
I'm assuming for some kind of like witch's brew or something.
For the bones.
Okay, yeah, right. So yeah, I bet owl pellets are in high demand in Chico.
Yeah.
There's probably not enough owl pellets for the amount of witch stuff that goes on in this town.
No.
Need to import some more owls.
We're gonna need to open up a witch imports store.
Chico, organic witch supplies for all your owl pellet needs. No rodents were actually harmed in the creation of these owl pellets.
Surprise bag. Well, every owl pellet is a surprise bag. You buy it and you don't really know what kind of parts you're gonna get. So you don't know what the owl is eating.